tuned in to the Andrew Lawton Show.
There's not a consensus among ordinary Canadians that the plastics ban is the way to go and that plastic straws should be just relegated to exile here. I want to welcome in our old friend Kris Sims, our Monday correspondent and the Alberta director for the Canadian Taxpayers Federation. Kris, what about you? Are you hearing this rumored consensus around the plastics ban?
Of the ban on plastic straws. You probably saw, of course, the famous now picture of Premier Danielle Smith, your co-host. Is she still your radio co-host? Are you still?
I don't know. I've never been technically relieved of my guest hosting duties, so I'm not sure.
Andrew is always on standby at any moment to step in as Alberta Premier. So just in case he throws down the microphone and leaves, that's what he has to go do. So yeah. Premier Danielle Smith had a pretty funny joke where I think she was drinking a ginger ale, and she had 2 plastic straws shoved together, and she was drinking it like this. And it's one of those things, right, where I think it's more than just it being silly to have this kind of gross paper straw that's disintegrating in your drink. I think it's because this has really gotten up into people's faces, right? Like what you're choosing to eat with, right? What you're choosing to eat, that sort of stuff. That's really kind of a domestic personal choice. And I think the plastic straw thing versus the paper straw thing really bugged people. And so I think it's emblematic really of how this government is operating. What I found interesting is that it sounds now like he's trying to make noise that perhaps a global treaty on plastics and everybody agreeing on plastics might be too complicated. That's the first time I have ever heard that minister tap the brakes on anything. Now, I could be misinterpreting him, but some of the tone that was coming from Minister Guilbeault there, I found a little bit more slowed down than he usually is. I'll also point out that people just don't want these sorts of bans. So in the city of Edmonton, for example, there's now this big bag fee. It's 15 cents per bag, and then it's going to be going up to 25 cents per bag. Pretty soon it's going to be $2 per reusable bag. You know, those things that are filling up all of our sink cupboards and all of our pantries, at least speaking for myself. And so that's really costing people a lot of money, and people are pushing back on it. They push back on it so hard in Calgary, Andrew, that they've had to repeal it. So Calgary tried doing this whole, you're going to have to pay every single time you use a bag. And now they've had to back off on it completely. So I think they are getting some serious pushback on this.
Yeah, and I mean, my view on the plastic straws thing has never been that plastic straws are my hill to die on. It's that a government that's going to regulate something so small and so minor will also regulate the big things that do matter. And I think you need to push back against these small incursions. And to be fair, a lot of companies now are keeping with the plastic straws. Now, I don't know if that's just because they're buying into the environmental argument, or if it's just because they're not exactly confident that the ban won't be reimposed, or they had to invest so much in all of this inventory and redo their supply chains around it, whatever the case is. But I've never been against individual companies doing that. It's always been when government is the one that manages it and manipulates it. And absolutely, if they're going to, because that's how regulation comes. That's how government grows. They regulate the things that people are already doing, and then they start encroaching a little bit more on other things. And at a certain point, the regulatory regime has gotten so large, you can't really dismantle it.
Yes, exactly. And before you know it, you're trying to balance all of your groceries leaving the store. In fact, just this past weekend, when I managed to go get our groceries, I was watching this lady, and she clearly, I don't know if she didn't have the money to buy another bag on top of another bag that she must have forgotten in her car, but she was trying to leave. And you know those little roast chickens that come in like the plastic container thingy, and they've got the little cardboard sleeve? She had 3 of them in her hand, like she'd grabbed like this, like without the bag. And she's trying to get past the lottery counter, and they're about to fall out. And so luckily one of the checkout ladies ran after her and just gave her a paper bag, like, shh, don't tell anyone here. Right. And she managed to make it to her store. And this is what I'm getting at is that the hill to die on? Well, logically, no. But that's such a personal thing, right? They're right up in your grill, right at the grocery store counter all the time. They're right there for your meal with your family at the restaurant all the time. And to your point, I think that then is what gives them more incursion into your life. And further, on the idea of a global issue when it comes to plastics, a couple of years ago, it was in the New York Post, and I'm trying to recall from memory here, I think they reported that 9 out of 10 of the plastic polluting rivers in the world were in Asia, and in Africa. Meaning this is not a problem, you know, that terrible idea of the garbage patch and the big floating amount of plastics pollution in the ocean. It's not coming from North America, and it's not coming from Europe. So why the strange impositions on Canadians? Like, I have never seen someone pick up, you know, a coffee cup and throw it into a river. People would have a stroke in Canada if you watch somebody do that. Further, I often see volunteer organizations from every walk of life. That's often what they'll go do, is pick up litter in the spring and make sure our shorelines are nice and clean. And so it would be probably smarter for the Trudeau government to encourage that sort of behavior instead of always with the stick, which doesn't result in anything.
Yeah, and a lot of it's funny because the government will always use moments where it believes it has political capital to do big things. So in Canada, we've seen firearms law that have done this. A lot of the push for a plastics ban came after that viral video of a sea turtle, a poor sea turtle that had a plastic straw suck up its nose. It was tragic. It was difficult to watch. It also was not Canadians' problem, and it was not Canadians' fault. This was you mentioned it earlier, this was the Danielle Smith picture where she celebrated the plastics ban and engaged in a consumption of ginger ale there. I still like mine better, though, because I was a bit more celebratory, I think, than the Premier was. There we go. Yeah, that was
reminds
mine.
me.
Take that, sea turtles.
Take that, sea turtles. Oh,
yeah, no sea turtles were harmed in the making of that gag. But again, it's the little things that matter.
Yeah, for sure. And you know what? The sea turtle picture, and I remember it because it was very impressionable, right? And it's awful. It reminds me, I grew up in the 80s. It reminds me of this video footage that all of us 80s kids saw of, you know, those 6-ring plastic things that go around a 6-pack?
Oh, yeah.
It showed a duck.
I was gonna describe them, and I realized you already did. I know exactly what you're talking about.
Yes. It showed a duck, and this poor bird, this waterfowl, I don't remember what kind of duck, sorry, but this waterfowl had this around its neck. And I remember this video was everywhere, and this is way before the interwebs, kids, but it really made an impression. And so now you can find, like, any Gen Xer, if you watch them with those things, they're snipping them into little tiny pieces before
my wife does that as well, and I always wonder, maybe she got the video.
I guarantee you she saw the video of this duck. And so this is my point, is that people who are in a position to care do care, and they take efforts to make sure that they aren't endangering the environment. And I think that's what annoys people a lot, is when they see something like this coming from the Trudeau government saying, you know what, guys, I've got this. How about you guys figure out how to balance the budget, or maybe run the passport office in town? I can figure out my recycling in my own home. And on top of this, if they start getting into something like a plastics registry, I just shudder to think at how much money they're going to spend on this. To your point earlier, with the failed long gun registry, we wound up blowing almost $2 billion on that thing. And it didn't make Canadians any safer from the lawful duck hunters here in Canada. Same thing going with this current gun confiscation. Again, taking firearms away from law-abiding firearms owners. They haven't seized a single one yet, and they've already blown millions of dollars. So just imagine what kind of money they could burn with the plastics registry here in Canada.
So I wanted to move to your old province here for a moment, British Columbia. British Columbia is a useful test case for a lot of things. I think for drug policy, it's been a useful test case now, because this is what happens when the decriminalization, harm reduction left gets its way. But also on the carbon tax, because BC had a carbon tax. I was going to say before it was cool. It's not cool now. But BC had a carbon tax before the federal government pushed one. So we've got a fair bit of runway in BC to see what a carbon tax does. And shocking answer is, Kris?
Emissions have gone up. Up, not down, with a carbon tax. And thank you for giving me a chance to highlight this, because this is something that was brought up. I did a debate. Sorry, I talked to another show host, but it wasn't for very long, and I didn't.
All right, get lost.
I did a debate on TVO with Steve Bacon. I wasn't debating him, but I was debating a University of Ottawa professor, and he said something to the effect of, and I'm paraphrasing, well, emissions in British Columbia have gone down. No, they have not. And in fact, if you pull up the government website and you can pull up the actual data, I don't know if you guys have the screen captures there. It looks like a super boring website, but you can click on something called provincial inventory. And it pulls up this spreadsheet, and it goes way back to, like, you know, the 1990s, right? So there we go. So this is the British Columbia government website. If you click on the provincial inventory there, where you see that hyperlink, and it pops up into an Excel sheet. And from there, you can take a look at the data. So the BC Liberal government, led by then Premier Gordon Campbell, introduced the provincial carbon tax in British Columbia back in 2008. So it came into effect in fiscal year 2008-2009. Back then, just to note, they introduced it as being revenue neutral. On paper it was, because they did do a corresponding income tax cut that year, but very quickly it became just a huge tax grab. So spoiler alert. But if you go to the actual data site and you take a look starting in 2009, you can see how many total megatons of carbon, CO2, was emitted that year. Then if you follow along 10 years, okay, so 10 years is usually a good data set. Go from 2009 to 2019, emissions went up, Andrew, by more than 7%. Even if we wanted to include the terrible years of when people were locked in their homes or businesses were shut down and they weren't allowed to travel, right, during the pandemic and the lockdown years of 2020, 2021, it still went up by nearly 2%. So this is the whole point. When the BC government first hatched this carbon tax back in 2008, which, by the way, is the model, the Trudeau government has said out loud that British Columbia is their model for the carbon tax. So what you see there, they're the canary, right? So they promised back in 2008 that their carbon tax would stop at $30 a ton, be revenue neutral, reduce emissions, and that they would provide a whole bunch of alternative affordable energy sources. None of those things is true today.
The problem that I have with this is that the sensible response is that someone says, oh, wow, I guess this isn't working. But that's never the way they go. The way they go is, wow, we're not doing it aggressively enough, or it would have been worse if we didn't. And that's the most challenging part of this, is that you're making an incredibly valid point that will be completely reversed in meaning by the people that brought us in here in the first place.
You're right. And that is often what they say. So on the first one, wow, that means we're not doing it hard enough. Okay, what do you guys want? Like, you already see record lineups for food banks, okay? You already see people not being able to afford to heat their homes. So the average Alberta family, for example, is going to be out more than $900 this year, net, with the carbon tax. That's caused by the carbon tax. The folks in British Columbia, they're getting screwed even more, frankly, Andrew, because by the time a two-person working family hits around $72,000 a year, around there out there, they get zero for a rebate. So if you are a hairdresser and you're married to a grocery store manager, you're not getting any rebate in British Columbia. Like, all of the middle class there is getting completely screwed on the carbon tax. So my question to them then would be, okay, what do you want? You want people freezing to death in the dark? What do you mean, do it harder? And secondly, the idea that, oh, well, if we hadn't done it, it would have been higher than it would have been. That's magical thinking, because we can't know. Like, we cannot know that. And what's interesting here is that politicians will promise you all sorts of things, like I mentioned. They said it was going to stop at $30 a ton, be revenue neutral, reduce emissions, all that great stuff. And then when their scheme doesn't work out, they run out onto the pitch and they move those goalposts really fast. I've also heard people say, oh, well, there's more people there now. Okay, so what then? You want to shut down immigration to British Columbia? Is that your plan? Because none of this makes sense. Every single time they try to set something up, it doesn't work and it doesn't make sense. And what's super frustrating is that when you give them a mathematical solution of, okay, tackle the big end of the arithmetic problem, sell natural gas, to your point with the Polish leader there, sell natural gas to India, reduce their super heavy duty emissions. They don't like that answer. They're clinging to this carbon tax in almost a religious way, even though it's not working.
Yeah, very well said. All right, well, great points all around, Kris. We will check. Oh, no, I'm off next Monday, so we'll check in with you in 2 weeks.
Oh.
But thank you so much, as always, for coming on. Always great to talk to you, Kris, from the Canadian Taxpayers Federation.
Safe travels.
Thanks for listening to The Andrew Lawton Show. Support the program by donating to True North at www.tnc.news.